Welcome to this Getting Started with SharePoint Framework tutorial series. And in this tutorial, we're looking into how to use Office UI Fabric React components in your SharePoint client-side web part. So by default, SharePoint Online does use Office UI Fabric React components to render the UIs and out-of-the-box experiences and out-of-the-box web parts. And you can take advantage of these components, which are open source, available for you from the internet. So we are providing this as a NPM packages, and they have their own version and logic and everything else. Now, because Office UI Fabric React components are also used by the out-of-the-box web parts, and those out-of-the-box web parts have their own versioning logic rather than matching on your versions, which you have in the third-party web part, third-party components. There are certain things which we need to understand when we're using the Office UI Fabric React components. And the main thing to understand related on using these components is that you cannot dynamically reference the Office UI Fabric React components which the SharePoint is providing by default for first-party web parts. And that's mainly because your custom web part might actually be developed, let's say, a month ago or 2 months ago or 3 months ago. And it might actually have a dependency on a different version of the Office UI Fabric React components than the first-party web parts. And whenever the Office UI Fabric React components will evolve, your components or your web part might be assuming that there's a property and method which has been changed or the signature has been changed, and that would then cause a runtime exception. That's why when we use the Office UI Fabric React components, we actually want to bundle that version inside of your web part or inside of your extension, so that we make sure that your component and solution is working regardless of what versions of Office UI Fabric React components SharePoint will natively use in first-party web parts. Now, a long tutorial intro, but just to make sure that we also covered that one. So this is September 2018 edition. We keep on evolving these tutorials as we move along within the journey of introducing you newer versions of SharePoint Framework. Now, in this case, like mentioned, we're going to use Office UI Fabric React components. A long intro on why do we need to reference that in a certain way, but let's see what it means in practice. So first of all, let's go again to our tutorial folder, and let's create a tutorial, a folder for our solution. So we're not going to actually add this web part any of the existing solution which we might have. We're going to create a new solution for this one, just for the clarity perspective. Obviously, you can have multiple web parts and extensions in a single solution. That's absolutely by default the model, which quite often actually will happen in the production use case. Now, let's follow up on the tutorial guidance. So let's actually accept. Let me scroll slightly up. If you're wondering, I'm personally using the Commander tool. It doesn't really matter what command line tool you're using to actually execute the Yeoman templates. Now, we want to use the default name for that one. We want to use the SharePoint Online as the target. We want to use the current folder. In this case, we're not going to actually deploy this to SharePoint Online, so it doesn't really matter are we going to use the tenant scoped option or not. So let's actually say no. But we never actually go as far as deployment, so that doesn't really matter what we answer on that question. Now, in this case, we want to actually create a web part. So let's choose that one. Let's give it a name of DocumentCard example. And this is DocumentCard example description is fine for now. And in this case, we want to actually use React. So once again, technically, I could actually select no JavaScript framework, and then I could associate React and the React components by running npm install to that particular solution. So by default, even though we have no JavaScript framework, React and Knockout here, we do support whatever framework what you want to be used in SharePoint Framework. By default, in a template perspective, out of the box, we only create React or provide React and Knockout templates and the no JavaScript framework option. So let me actually start a scaffolding that will then start pulling down the npm dependencies from the npm gallery. And at this point, we're going to speed up the video and continue whenever the scaffolding is fully completed. And here we go. Now the scaffolding is completed. So let's actually start Visual Studio Code, so we're able to see how the solution is structured. So even though we selected the React as the default or the starting point, obviously the basic structure is exactly the same. So key difference is now is the fact that in the package JSON, we're by default referencing React components. We are also referencing Office UI Fabric core here by default. So all of this stuff is happening automatically based on the selection. But basic solution structure, the config structure and everything else is exactly the same, like we would be selecting the No JavaScript Framework option. Now, one thing what is slightly different, actually the rendering is exactly the same, but the structure is slightly different because we're using React, is the default web part implementation. So in the React implementation, our web part is kind of a shell or container where we actually then call actual React component, which is here DocumentCard example. So this DocumentCard example is coming from the components, and DocumentCard example is the file name, and we're providing the description property from a web part to that component to render. So if we now extend the components, we can actually say that we can find the DSX file here. That is actually the one React component, which is then responsible of rendering the welcome to SharePoint text and the basic default rendering experience. What is exactly the same between the No JavaScript Framework selected or the React selected. So React changes slightly the structure of the components in a similar way as if you're using Angular or Vue or handlebars. They have a slightly different way of required rendering. The basic structure for any framework is still pretty much the same. So the web part works as a shell or a container from the web part properties. So all of these properties, everything else is still in the web part level, but then you initiate the actual external component. So in case of React, we're using this React element call or React create element call, and that's the component name. And we bypass the description entry from the web part properties then as a property for that React components. Again, if you're using any other framework, the setup looks slightly different, but again, it's framework specific. The basics are still the same. Web part as a shell or a container, and then the properties are in this level, and then they're bypassed to the actual JavaScript framework specific implementation of the functionality. Now, okay, so let's actually start using the Office UI Fabric React. So what we actually want to modify here is the rendering of this web part. So that's going to happen in this DocumentCard example DSX file. And what we want to use is a document card from Office UI Fabric React. So we're going to actually add DocumentCard preview, card title, activity, and DocumentCard property preview props interface from the Office UI Fabric lib and document card. So this is basically then giving us these components available for render. And then what we want to do is that we want to actually replace the existing render. So let's get rid of that and replace that one with a new render option. So in here, what we can see what we're doing here, we are setting document card preview props. So we have a preview image, which is set to be as a document preview PNG. We have an icon source, which is set to be icon PPT and PNG. We're setting a white and height and accent color. And then this component is returning a structural in here, which is based on a document card. It has a preview section, it has a title section, which has the title name of a imaginary component. It has some activity, imaginary activity for a certain time period. So kind of a high level static data for now. Just as well, we could actually get this data directly from SharePoint or from a document library and then update these values based on the information what is coming from the document library level. Now let's save the changes. So Control X in my case. And then what we want to do is that we actually want to do a small modification in the gulp.js files. And the reason why we want to do this is that we want to actually reference these PNG files in the scenario example case. So what we're going to do here, so let me rephrase that. So what we want to do is that we want to mimic the situation where these images would be coming from SharePoint Online. But in this case, we're not connected on SharePoint Online. So we're just testing how to use Office UI Fabric React components. So for that purpose, we can actually modify slightly our column file, JSON file, which is in the root here. So we can actually modify this one slightly, and we can add this additional configuration, which will then get additional components available to be rendered from the distribution or dist path. So the basic idea is that we're able to then render the web part and provide those images which were referenced in these components using a static URL. So that's what we're doing here. Now, the next step, what is being asked is that we would get a few static images copied to this particular folder. So from the source web parts and DocumentCard example and components folder. So let's actually go in here. So I have those 3 images following up on the tutorial available in here. So these are actually stored in SP-DevDocs GitHub repository. So I'm going to copy them. I'm going to paste them in. I'm going to paste them inside of that library in the File Explorer. And that means obviously that the Visual Studio Code is seeing them as well. And now it makes more sense that we are referencing a document preview PNG, which is actually located over there. And that file is then an imaginary preview of that document. So we're kind of a mimicking situation and the information which we would be able to get from SharePoint Online document library level. Good, that's all we're going to do this time. So we reference and we're using DocumentCard. We are then rendering the DocumentCard data with static data. We could just as well use, again, SharePoint REST API to get dynamic information from SharePoint. And we're going to move back on the command line. And let's actually do call observe. And that's going to, again, pop up the preview and the local workbench in the previous session of my default browser. So let me actually go to the right browser window in here. And let me actually, in my case, it's actually open up that in a different browser. So I'm going to request the URL manually, localhost 4321, and adding that web part available, the DocumentCard web part available from there. And there we go. We have a nice web part available. We didn't modify the properties of the web part. We didn't modify or add any actual functionality, but you can see that pretty easily by using the components from the Office UI Fabric React, we were able to create a really nice looking layout, and just as well we would be able to render multiple other layouts here as well. So the Office UI Fabric React components will give you a consistent look and feel which is matching on the first-party web part. So basically whatever Microsoft is building and Microsoft is releasing inside of SharePoint Online, and actually on the other services as well. So the Office UI Fabric React components will give you consistency. It will increase your productivity because you don't actually need to build this kind of rendering by yourself. It's just a matter of reusing these existing components which are available for you by default. Good, but that's everything what we're going to do in this tutorial. So we were able to reuse Office UI Fabric React components. In this case, we reference them directly, like we do in the production case, from the Office UI Fabric React NPM packages, which were added there because we added by default we choose the React framework as the selected framework to be used. But really easy way to have a consistent look and feel and nice look and feel and reusable components which will increase your productivity as a developer. So please have a look more on Office UI Fabric React components from our documentation. Thank you.